Well, this is the first live chat. New software? What could possibly go wrong? Well, hello. This is our first live chat, and it's called the Debug edition because, well, I'm using brand new software. I'm using a process I've never done before. And we're going to see how this works out and if you guys like it. The format's going to be just really straightforward. What we're going to do is we're going to take your questions and try to answer as many we can in roughly about an hour. The reason I'm doing this is because I'm starting to find the questions overwhelming, and I need to start sort of limiting the questions to a format where everyone can get the chance to ask what they want without there being necessarily overlap. So we are going to take live chats. I think Super Chat is enabled. At least it should be. Again, this is the Debug edition where we find out everything that's going to go wrong and try to fix that along the way, or find out what went wrong and fix it next time. So that's why it's called the Debug edition. And of course we have, let's see here, Orthodox of the USA has a question. Why am I not surprised? He's been one of the best questioners from the very, very beginning of this channel. So let's see. I can ask a question on your thoughts on Josephus. Says, quote, against Apion. Do you think this is good evidence for the Exodus? I'm not a great fan of Josephus when it comes to old history. I should qualify that. I think he's really, really good when it comes to his current events of his time. But I think when he starts looking at some of the older stuff, older history, I think he starts falling back on, say, the legends of his time, and I don't see him being a reliable witness at that point. He uses sources that I think are not good, and there's not much more to say about that unless we get into specifics. So this is, again, we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can in the roughly hour we have. So if I am a little brief, it's because I want to get as many questions in. So I'm not sure how to click on a question. So again, this is a debug edition. I'm trying to figure this out as we go along. So I don't know how, if I can highlight a question here. Let's take this one here. Okay. How did I come to know Christ? I was 7 years old. I grew up in an evangelical Christian home. My parents are both Christian. They both are believers. I went to church every Sunday like a lot of kids who grew up in the church. And I just felt one day compelled to give my life to Christ. I was 7 years old. There wasn't a lot of ceremony or fanfare. I didn't even tell my parents for like the first year that I had actually accepted Christ. So it was just one of those things that was at that time deeply, deeply personal to me, and I just sort of knew it was the right thing to do and pursued it. So it was very strange because, I've heard people say that they came to Christ out of like fear of hell or something like that, but that was not the experience I had. It was more like, this is where my life was meant to go. So that's what I did. So I hope that answers the question. All right. Again, I'm trying to figure out how this all works. Am I accepting questions from both super chats and regular chats? Christian Rush. Here's how it's going to work. Super chats are going to get priority on the questions. They're paying money, of course they're going to get priority. So that's just common sense. If there isn't anyone chatting, again, I'll take other questions. I'm more than happy to take questions. One of the things about super chats, though, is it pins itself automatically to the top, so I get to see those immediately. They don't sort of rush past. I can already see that the amount of chats that are going on here are coming fast and furious, so I might not be able to keep up with all the other questions. So I'm going to try to take as many questions as I can, but super chats are going to get the first shot at this. And I have to say, too, that super chats do directly support this channel. The fact is that one of the limitations I have is that I have to work full-time as well. So it does really, really help the channel to do those super chats. So again, I'll take as many questions as I have, and looks like I have a super chat already. So let me click on those and let's see what we got here. Okay. Christian Rose donated $5. Thank you very much. Did you watch the Pharaoh's Golden Parade? If so, what was your reaction? Because as Orthodox cried. Okay, I thought it was a great spectacle. I did see the Pharaoh's Golden Parade. It was a great spectacle. It was wonderful to see. But I also responded to it differently because one of the things I specialized in when I did my doctoral research was ritual processions. And I really, really love ritual processions as far as their ancient Egyptian ritual contexts. So to see a modern-day version of a ritual procession being done, moving the artifacts from the old Egyptian museum to the gem, was actually really, really interesting to watch. I had to admit I enjoyed watching it. I don't think there was anything sort of especially religiously significant about it, but it was fascinating to see. So I hope that answers your question. Michael Cato, thank you very much for your $4.99 super chat. God bless and thank you for your work. Have you looked into Ezekiel's prophecy concerning Nebuchadnezzar conquering, attacking Egypt? Yes, I have looked into it. I think that it is very, very telling about... It's really about the fact that the prophecy concerns that Egypt will itself be conquered and reduced to basically a rump state. And that definitely was happening. That definitely did happen. Now, was it specifically about Nebuchadnezzar? That's the question that's going to always be raised with that particular prophecy. The brutality that was exposed to the Egyptians from the Babylonians was actually nothing compared to what happened to them later on with the Persians. Nebuchadnezzar when he conquered Egypt, he stole all the gold. I mean, part of the reason why the ritual furniture in Egypt sort of transitions from this splendorous, beautiful furniture to kind of this cringy kind of kitschy after effect was because of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. Nebuchadnezzar ended up taking almost all the gold from Egypt. So he's largely really responsible for the plunder of Egypt. Now, his successors in the Persian Empire, though, were really, really brutal to the Egyptians. No one was unhappy to see the Persians go when they were actually finally defeated. However, the Persians also were responsible for the destruction of, say, native Egyptian rule. In fact, the Persians were the power that ultimately defeated Egyptian native princes, such as another native prince never ruled on the throne after the Persians. So, after the Persians, you had the Greeks, and then finally the Romans, and then ultimately the Arabs and Islamic rule. So the Egyptians were never again able to attain South rule because of the weakening initially caused by Nebuchadnezzar's invasion. So let's see what else we got here. Let's see, do we have others? What we got here? Oh, we got another super chat. Benjamin Rush. You said you have an undergrad background in philosophy. Who are your favorite philosophical influences? Okay, that's a very interesting question. But yes, indeed, my undergrad is in philosophy, and I earned that at the University of British Columbia. I was mostly doing a combination of philosophy of religion and philosophy of science. So I did a lot of, say, just the standard proofs for God. I also did a lot of the philosophy of science and how it relates to our understanding and beliefs. So I didn't actually. I was really big into Plato. I was very big into Platonic philosophy. I found Platonic philosophy absolutely fascinating as an undergrad. So it was uh, it was really a change for me to actually do philosophy because my first 2, 3 years of my undergrad was actually in the physical sciences. I actually started off doing a degree in biochemistry. And only in like year 3, I said, I really don't like biochemistry that much. And I got out of it and did the remainder of my degree in philosophy. So I dedicated my last 2 years into philosophy and really, really enjoyed that. It was a very, very different experience. It was more the experience I'd actually hoped for going to university, which was doing a lot of reading. I'm a voracious reader. I love to read. So for me, doing the sciences, I didn't do as much reading as I'd hoped. So doing the philosophy program was just more along the lines of what I really enjoyed doing. So I can't say there was one particular modern writer that really influenced me. I had teachers though that very much influenced me in the program, and from that I was able to develop that tool set that I have now used in my, say, later graduate work and in my professional career. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you again for the super chat. Always appreciated. Okay. Let's see what we got. Oh, by the way, is the sound coming through okay? Because I have to. Let me just ask the question because the sound, my sound box is a little touchy, so I do have to ask if my sound is coming okay. So if you can please leave a little bit of feedback about the sound, I'd really appreciate it. Again, this is the debug edition. We're working out the bugs. Okay. Converse Contender. Super chat for $3. Highs and lows of being interviewed. Highs and lows of being interviewed. Okay, I'll basically say this: the highs and lows of being interviewed. Love being interviewed. I think interviews are some of the best things that I think uh, are part of this. I love being interviewed by other. I love having conversations with people. Conversations are fantastic. I think that's the best. I don't like debates. I'm not a debater. I tend to get over competitive when I debate, so it sort of brings out the worst tendencies in me. But I love conversations. I love talking about ideas, the big ideas, the evidence. Those are the things I really, really enjoy doing. And I love sort of the rabbit trails that happen sometimes. That's for me the high points. The low points are, say, when my sometimes faulty memory kicks in and I misremember something and I missay something. And then I go back and go, oh man, I know better than that. And, I have to say, okay, yeah, I'm just human. I do tend to forget things sometimes. And, that seems shocking, but that does happen. So those are the low points for me. The high points are just talking to people. I love talking to people. Okay. Tom Bombattle, great handle name. Love it. Thank you for the super chat. Can you tell me a fun, weird story from Egyptian history that people don't usually see in basic history but you enjoy? Oh, I love the story of Wenamun. The Wenamun is probably actually a real biography that was written in a tomb somewhere, but it talks about a priest, a scribe, who was sent to Tyre to get lumber for the temple of Amun, and he's given a sack of gold, and he loses the sack of gold in Thebes or in Memphis, but he still has to go to Tyre, and he has to get the wood and come back, and it's more of a real comedy of errors. He goes to the king of Tyre and he says, "Well, my predecessor, your predecessor, just gave us the wood. We didn't have to give you gold." And the king of Tyre goes, "Yeah, right. We'll see. Let's get the day roll out and see what really happened." So it's a really, really humorous story from ancient Egypt that I think is absolutely wonderful. More people need to read it. It's interesting. It's an interesting look into the Levant. It's just a wonderful, wonderful story, and it's funny too. So that's one of my favorite stories from ancient history that I think people should know more about. Okay. Kristen Roche. Again, Rush, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. What is your favorite Egyptian creation myth? Ooh. There's several great Egyptian creation myths. You have, say, the myth of Re, where he's an egg born on the water, and the egg hatches, and out of it comes the sun god Re. But I also really, really like the Memphite theology. The Memphite theology is really interesting because the Memphite theology features the god Ptah. Ptah is a creator god. What Ptah does is he just thinks and speaks things into existence, and they just happen. It's really, really an interesting myth because we find this on the Memphite, the Shabaka stone, which is this great big stone that's found in. It's now located in the British Museum. It's a big black stone. It was once used as a millstone, but it records this papyrus where the priests of Memphis are having this sort of theological duel with the priests of Heliopolis as to say, who's the better god? Who's the better creation god? Because Ra creates things through, let's just say, male ejaculation. And that's how Ra created things as creator god. Well, the priests of Memphis coming on and say, well, that's just gross. Our God does something better. He doesn't need to do some bodily function to make things work. He just thinks it and speaks it, and therefore it happens. Now, this is very interesting from, say, a Judeo-Christian point of view, because when we look at, say, Genesis, we see that God in Genesis, says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Our God thinks it, and it's enough for it to be. So that's a very, very interesting comparison. So there's actually a lot of very interesting creation myths in Egyptian culture. I also love the creation myth of Khnum, who's another creator god who makes man out of clay on a potter's wheel. So that's also a very interesting connection to the Bible too, because it connects, say, the whole idea of Adam being created from the earth. Thank you very much for your question and your super chat. Okay, we got another one from Michael Cato. What are your thoughts on the Levite hypothesis? Has become quick. Okay, my thoughts on the Levite hypothesis. Now, if you listen to Michael Friedman, one thing he talks about is his work is really, really predicated on the documentary hypothesis. Now, when you look at what Michael Friedman says, like you listen to any of his lectures, the first thing he does is he goes and he gives you like, 80% of his lecture is going to be on the documentary hypothesis. And then he'll get into the Levite Exodus. The last bit of it will always be on the Levite Exodus. But he starts with the documentary hypothesis. The issue with the documentary hypothesis is that if there isn't a documentary hypothesis, there really isn't a good rationale for the Levite hypothesis. The Levite hypothesis and the documentary hypothesis are joined at the hip. You really can't have one without the other. So the idea that you have this very small group of Levites coming out of Egypt is Friedman's way of saying, okay, we have this documentary hypothesis that explains the origins of the scriptures, but we also want to keep the Exodus as well, so we'll have this mini Exodus that just then becomes expanded down oral history. The problem with this is that there are sections of the Pentateuch that are very, very old. And when I mean they're very old, I mean that the vocabulary, the names, there's a lot of evidence that seems to point to the fact that it's dates through the late Bronze Age. Now, if the sources are that old, you don't really need a documentary hypothesis because there's no oral tradition. So if you don't need a documentary hypothesis, the Levite hypothesis becomes sort of moot. So I don't place a lot of stock in the Levite hypothesis because I don't think you need a documentary hypothesis to explain the scriptures. So that's sort of the long and short of it. Okay, we got a super chat from Tyler McKaylee. Thank you very much for $5. What are your thoughts on... Is that just a $5 chat? It looks like just a $5. Well, thank you very much. If you have a question, I'd be willing to answer it, but I do appreciate the super chat also. So, better catch my breath. No, I don't want to list them. So I'm just going to take another question as we come up here. Let's just pick one at random here. Let's see here. I'm just going to take that one. Oh, wait, hold it. We got some super chats. Okay, white girl with Instagram black screen, $5. Thank you very much. It is often says that there is no evidence for King David's united monarchy. Do you think this, a good scholar who talks about this? Actually, several scholars are now talking about this. The fact is that the just recently deceased Elat Mazar, who was the daughter of the great Amarphel Mazar, she did the excavations at the city of David and discovered a palace and the Solomonic gate at the city of David. She was a great proponent of a united monarchy. And the fact is that the whole sort of tide on this issue has turned. 40 years ago, you wouldn't have found any scholar of repute say there was a united Davidic monarchy. Today, that's almost completely reversed. Today, almost everyone admits there was a united Davidic monarchy. The question now is not, was there a centralized united Israelite monarchy at the time of King David? The question is now, how vast was it? How big was it? How important was it? How powerful it was? Those are the questions that remain now. And the fact is, we just have too much archaeological evidence now to deny the fact that there was a united monarchy. So that's now well established, and we can now say with confidence that there was a King David in all likelihood, and King Solomon. We have the Tel Dan stela that has actually the House of David inscribed on it, and the great thing about that was found in situ. That means found in its archaeological context. So this was excavated at Tel Dan. So that was very, very interesting find. So we have this this inscription that confirms that the house of David existed. So the fact now that we have all these, like even at Tel el-Safi and the Shephelah, we're finding Israelite pottery, Israelite inscriptions that date to the 10th century. So there's more than enough compelling evidence now to say that there was a united Davidic monarchy. And as I said, very few people are now denying it. We got Benjamin Rush, $5 super chat. Thank you very much. Is there any connection between the Book of the Dead and the curses on the Genesis servant? Banish on the dust, trample the servants, crawl on belly, banish to dust, trample on the servants. I don't think so. Honestly, I don't think the Book of the Dead really plays a role in, say, the biblical account. I don't see any connections between the Book of the Dead. Now, I find connections between other Egyptian literature and the Bible. Like, for example, the Hymn of the Aten, and I believe it's Psalm 104. There's some strong parallels there. There's also connections between the instruction of Amenemope and other passages. I think Book of Proverbs has it. But the Book of the Dead doesn't seem to have played much of a role, if any, in the biblical literature. There's just not any strong parallels there. So I've heard some say conscious community members try to make a connection there, but I don't think there's any connection there. The few examples that they've cited, I go back to the original hieroglyphs and I don't see it, honestly. So I think the Book of the Dead is a great thing to read. I think it's interesting to read. It's a spell book. It's a magic spell book, and we have to remember that it is a magic spell book. And the biblical writers just don't seem to be that interested in magic spells. So I don't think there's any actual connection between the two. Hey, Tyler McKelly again. Why did many Egyptian dynasties practice sibling marriage? Now, here's the catch with sibling marriage. Most of sibling marriages weren't. Okay, it was practiced on rare occasions, but it was practiced as a form of sympathetic magic. Now, we have to understand what makes this topic so confusing was that it was a common sort of term of endearment to call your spouse, your wife, your sister, or your husband, your brother. This led to some Greek writers like Herodotus or other writers in, say, the late 19th century to conclude that Egyptians frequently married siblings, and that isn't true. Now, a study done by Ernst Czerny examined 400 marriages in ancient Egypt, and he found of 400, only 2 were actually consanguineous marriages, which means that they're related by blood as first cousins. Okay? So it was very, very unusual for it to happen. Now, it did happen under one circumstance in particular, where you had, say, a succession crisis. Probably the most famous of these consanguineous marriages was King Tutankhamun, the famous King Tut, to his wife, first wife, Ankh-Sunamun. And they were actually half brother and half sister. Now, the idea here was the thought that royal blood was really, really strong. And King Tut was basically the last Theban prince. And it was thought that if he didn't have children, this would be the end of the royal bloodline. Because his predecessor, Smenkhare, died childless. So what happened was, he was married off to his half. The fact is, the absolute opposite occurred. The fact that they were both siblings weakened the bloodline. And we have remains from the King Tut's tomb where 2 of his children were actually mummified and buried with him. So we know that there was an attempt to have children and it was not successful. So we do know it happened in times of succession crisis, but other than that, it was pretty rare. It might have happened occasionally during the Old Kingdom, But again, this was a rare occurrence. It didn't happen as nearly as often as many popular writers suggested, and it certainly didn't happen as much as Herodotus suggested. So it wasn't very common, but it did happen sometimes. It also sometimes happened in also during, say, the Ptolemaic period, but that was more to keep the reigns, the power of, say, two co-regents in the house, as it were. So it did happen, just not very often. Okay, JD3's super chat for $5. Thank you very much. Is there any reason to believe Genesis 1 to 11 is part of the more ancient sections of the Torah, or do you believe they are a later Babylonian edition? I do not believe they're a later Babylonian edition. I believe they are part of a late Bronze Age text. I think most of Genesis derives from sources that are from the late Bronze Age. You do see this in the vocabulary of Genesis, that there is a high preponderance of Egyptian vocabulary in Genesis, as you also find in Exodus. So I do think what you see in those texts are a reflection of its origins. So I don't think these are later Babylonian texts. If these were later Babylonian texts, you would find, say, more cognate material that that had vocabulary of Old Iranian. We don't find any of that in the Torah. It's the interesting thing about the Torah is it has lots of Egyptian vocabulary, but none of the Old Iranian vocabulary that we find in, say, later historical books and some of the minor prophets and writings. So I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that the early books of Genesis came from later Babylonian editions. I also think, too, that the dialectic that we do find in Genesis 1 to 11 is very much concurrent with, say, the mythology we find from the Levant and from, say, their Egyptian home or Egyptian starting point. So that dialectic, I think, is very, very important to consider when looking at Genesis 1 to 11. We see concepts of, say, Egyptian myth that are being not so much pulled into the narrative, but rejected using the narrative. So it's a matter of these being contrastive mythological statements. What sometimes I think is called anti-myth. Now we have to understand that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were a mixed multitude. They had many myths. They had many nations coming with them. You had Magi, you had Cushites, you had Nubians, you had Magi, you had Egyptians, you had Canaanites, you had Amorites, you had Libyans, all this diverse number of peoples. And each one of those people groups had their own creation myths. So when Moses brings them out of Egypt, he gives them instead a myth to counter all the various myths that are among the people. And this is, I think, the source of, say, the dialectic that we find in Genesis 1 through 11. It's the presenting the anti-myth that unifies all these various people groups into one. Okay. Another one from Christian Rose. Thank you again. With a late date of the Exodus, which pharaoh would we place at the time of Joseph? Did a paper on this in college and no real conclusion. Okay, we know that Joseph lived during the time of the Hyksos. So roughly 1666 BC onward. The problem is that our records of the kings of the second intermediate period are not complete. It could have been any number of kings of that time. We're just not sure who it was exactly. And until we get a inscription that has the, say, name, the Egyptian name of Joseph, which was um, um, Zephaniah Pa'am, we won't be able to really know which king that he was sort of serving under. So that's one of those really, really difficult questions. We have some of the names attested of the Hyksos kings, but we don't have by any means a complete list. We are still sort of figuring out how the second intermediate period worked. So that's always going to be a problem when we deal with, say, the time of Joseph. The fact is that the records are not just incomplete, that the Hyksos kings also ruled from Avaris, and Avaris has an unfortunately a incomplete archaeological record. All the texts are destroyed practically from Avaris, so there isn't a lot of textual evidence that we actually even have to go on. There was a volume published on all the texts of the Second Intermediate Period a number of years ago by Ben Publications. And it's basically works out to about 50 pages. I mean, it's really, really small, the number of texts we have from that period. There just wasn't great preservation, and we just don't have a lot of evidence at the time. So I would love to see a lot more evidence from the Second Intermediate Period, but unfortunately, we got to go with the evidence is what we have. So I can't give you an answer for that because we just don't know. I wish I could have a better answer. I love to say I'd know, but I don't. So again, until we get more evidence, we just have to be patient. But thank you for the super chat. Very, very much appreciated. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Ooh, all right. Take this one here. I'm going to take a regular question here that's not a super chat. Nathan Yadan. What is... Let's see here. Thoughts on Tel el-Hamman being Sodom. Okay. I have a couple thoughts on Tel el-Hamman. I don't think the case here is all that good for it to be Sodom. It could be. It's possible. But it also might not be. And here's the reason why it might not be. Now, when I looked at his video on Tel el-Hamman as Sodom, he showed a destruction layer below that was dates to, say, the Middle Bronze Age. And then he says that that the whole Late Bronze area was just wiped out. And above it, I noticed in stratigraphy a little piece of Late Bronze destruction layer. Now, one of the things he stated was that there's no destruction layer for the Late Bronze period, but the whole city is wiped out. Well, if there's a little piece of destruction layer there, then that might not have actually been the result of what he suggests, which was, say, a comet that wiped out Sodom. I think what is possible is that Tel el-Hamman might have been leveled, like we've now seen happen at Jericho through the research of Lorenzo Nigro. Nigro proved that Jericho actually was rebuilt during the Late Bronze Age, destroyed during the Late Bronze Age, and then the whole site had been leveled out. And that site leveling was then used to then build a Late Bronze, an Iron Age city on top of that. So I think it's very, very... we have to be now very, very cautious of any city now that claims to have an absence, where the archaeologist claims to say that there's an absence of a Late Bronze city. Because now all those claims are now up in the air. They're all up in the air. And Tel el-Hamman is no different. It could have just as easily been conquered by, say, Israelites. The site might have been leveled and then rebuilt on with Iron Age fortifications and houses. So I think the excavator has to do more to show that Tel el-Hamman is Sodom. I'm just not convinced yet. It could be, it's possible, but I think his dating is right. I think he selected the right dates for this. But I also think he has to do more work to show that it is really Sodom. I'm, again, not convinced about this. Another super chat from Kristen. There. Uh, Again, we are debugging this, so don't have a pin to put it back up there. Oh well. She says, "Thank you for putting up with me and Benjamin. My pleasure. I mean, you're giving me lots of super chats. It's more than my pleasure to put up with this." And you're asking good questions too, so it's a win-win. Everyone gets good questions, everyone benefits, and you're helping out the channel. I think this is wonderful. This is a pleasure. I'm more than happy to. Okay, let's see here. Okay, let's see here. Go with this one here. Next one up. Where did my pins all go is the question. All right. Ancient Egypt in the Bible. What books would you recommend for apologists to read? Be able to make a case for the evidence of the Exodus. It's a great question. There's actually several good books out there. I would recommend the Baker Background Studies to the Old Testament. That's recent and it's very, very good. There's for a more technical discussion, there's the book. It's a blue cover. Did I Not Bring My People Out of Egypt? Excellent book. Again, these are very, very recent books. So if you go, say, for a little some older material that's still solid, I would recommend Ken Kitchen's on the reliability of the Old Testament. It's a little dated, but it's still very, very good. I would also recommend my own book, which is the Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian context, an illustrated journey. That book gives you sort of the evidence for, say, the Ark of the Covenant. And I think the book that I just did is important because it shows you what the breadth of the evidence is. A lot of these books say condense the evidence, but they don't actually show you the evidence. I think books that actually show you the evidence and how wide and expansive it is are very, very valuable to the apologist, because the apologist really should have an understand how much data is out there. I think that's one of the things that we are learning through, say, this channel here, is that it isn't just ones or twosy evidence, pieces of evidence here or there. This is not a case where, say, one piece of evidence proves the Exodus. This is an inductive case. It's built up slowly. It's built up with lots and lots of cumulative evidence that builds upon itself. One of, say, the traps I think for an apologist is that they tend to rush to the conclusion. And many times the most compelling cases are made by slowly building the evidence one piece at a time. And then you get this pile, this mountain of evidence. And through the mountain, you're able to show that something happened. That's how a good inductive case is made. And this is what we find historical disciplines like, say, Egyptology or ancient history do, is they don't take just single pieces of evidence. They build upon it. So I think it's very, very important for, say, the apologist that wants to engage in topics like the Exodus to get a feel for what the evidence is actually like. So I think that you can really engage this. I think more people do need to engage the topic of the Exodus, but I think also we need to do it the same way, say, ancient historians have to do it, because that's the way it's sort of the evidence has come to us. It's also the way that it ends up being the most persuasive. So there's lots of ways you can do this, but again, take those books that really show the pieces. Read lots of archaeological reports too. They're fascinating. You see all sorts of really interesting tidbits in the archaeological reports. Yes, it's a lot of reading. Good apologists also need to do lots of reading. We had a chat here. Kato, I didn't catch it, but I do see it here. I'll just read it out. Thank you very much for your super chat. Do you see the trajectory of scholarship on the Exodus to change over the next few decades as it has for the Davidic monarchy? Pin? Oh, wait. Yes, absolutely. It's already changing. It's already changing. As I said, 40 years ago, you wouldn't have found a single scholar that would have either, supported a historic evidence or historic David. Today, you find almost all parties, support historical dating David, but very few support a historical Exodus. But at the same time, too, there are now scholars that do support a historical Exodus. So I do think the pendulum is swinging in the other direction. So yes, I absolutely expect it to change. But how does it change? It changes by being careful with the data, by pointing out the evidence, but not overstating the evidence. I think this is really, really important, that when we talk about the evidence for the Exodus, but we don't overstate it. We have to take the evidence in its context, in its historical context, in its literary context, not overstate it, and not try to force the evidence to fit where it doesn't belong. I think this is one of the problems we saw with, say, the patterns of evidence stuff, where they tried to take the Ippaware papyrus and try to fit it into, say, a New Kingdom context when it is clearly a Middle Kingdom context. So you have to always be careful with how you handle data. You show your scholarly integrity by how you handle the data. And if you're careful with the data and don't overstate the data, people are more likely to trust what you say about the data. So I think as we get more careful scholarship here talking about the Exodus, I do expect a lot of things to change. So, but we're just at the moment just seeing the beginning of that change. I think there's going to be much, much more to come with how the Exodus is. So I hope that answers the question. Okay. Anything else here? Let's see here. I'm gonna take this one here. Okay, and here. My interface here is a little slow. There we go. Okay. Charles Smith asks, "Hi, Dr. Falk. This is a 2-in-1 question. When was Avaris abandoned, and how can we be sure that the people who would become the Israelites lived at that time and left?" Okay. It was abandoned early to mid Dynasty 19. That's during the reign of Ramses II. That much we know from the archaeological excavations. How do we know that they would become the Israelites? The people who would become the Israelites lived at that time and left. Okay, the people who lived at Avaris at that time were Amoritic Semitic Asiatics, which is a long word of saying that these were people from the Levant. They were had an Amorite related language. They followed Canaanite customs and practices, and they pretty much had a Canaanite material culture, basically from the earliest times at Avaris, which was Dynasty 11, all the way up till the time they left in Dynasty 19. Now, the establishing the direct connection between them and the Israelites is somewhat circumstantial. We have to admit that it is somewhat circumstantial. We don't have any evidence that says, we dig at Avaris and says the Israelites were here. The fact is they weren't called Israelites at the time. They become Israelites as a result of the Exodus. So up until that point, they're just Canaanites. They're just Asiatics. So we would only expect them to be Asiatics while they lived at Avaris. Catch this super chat before it disappears on me, but I'll finish the question. So when they move out of Avaris, they're just Asiatics. So we understand, though, that at roughly 40-ish years later from the Exodus, Jericho is destroyed. Sometime near that time, Hatzor is destroyed. During the 5th regnal year of Merneptah, Israel becomes named as a nation inside of Canaan by King Merneptah. So you take all that circumstantial evidence and you basically have to say, okay, well, who else could this be? So it does fit the pattern of the narrative. So we don't have a one-to-one direct evidential link between the people at Avaris and the Israelites, but boy, it's a darn good guess. It's a darn good. The evidence certainly points to that direction. So we have to admit that that's probably the best it's going to get, given the fact that they become Israelites in the wilderness. And they are coming out of Egypt, but they become galvanized as a nation as the mixed multitude becomes integrated into the 12 tribes. So it's at that point that we say, yes, here is where the Israelites become Israelites, is in Sinai. And finding evidence of, say, the birth of the Israelite nation in Sinai is going to be tough, just because of the conditions of the wandering in the wilderness. So I hope that answers the question. Now, JD Freeze just gave a super chat of $5. Thank you very much. Did Hebrew exist as a distinct language at the time of the Exodus, or would the early Israelites have used a proto-Canaanite dialect? Well, yes, Hebrew would have existed as a distinct language, but it was probably the dialect that was already being spoken at Avaris. So it was probably it's definitely a Canaanite dialect. It's a Semitic dialect. It comes from a branch of a languages called Western Semitic. And Proto-Canaanite is actually the earlier descendant. Proto-Canaanite actually, or what was called better known as Proto-Semitic dialect, basically splits into two branches. It splits into Western Semitic and Eastern Semitic. Your Eastern Semitic languages are your Akkadian, your Babylonian, those sorts of languages. Your Western Semitic languages break off into little groups of languages called, like Hurrian, Moabite, and the little dialects of the Levant. So that's sort of the divide here between the two languages. And the early Hebrew would have definitely have been part of that sort of Western Semitic language family. So when they had left Avaris, they were probably already speaking Hebrew, because Hebrew had developed from, say, earlier Semitic languages. So I have every expectation to believe that the language they spoke and they wrote down the Pentateuch in was Hebrew. The question is, though, what sort of evidence for Hebrew do we find along the way? And that's always going to be sort of the details here that we need to sort of flesh out as we go along studying history of the Hebrew language. Okay, I hope that answers that question. I think we have. Let's see. Place. Okay. I'm going to replace the pin here. And okay. When do you think the Battle of Genesis 14 occurs, especially if Amarphel of Shinar as Hammurabi reigned in the 18th century BC? That's a tough one because we don't exactly know when. The problem is we can't really identify. Here's the thing: the names in Genesis 14 for the Elamite kings could be one of three contemporary-ish Elamite kings. Unless we can figure out exactly which Elamite king is being referenced, and they're very, very close to what we have recorded. All three of those kings are very, very close to what we have recorded in Genesis 14. Until we can sort of determine which one of those kings is that exact Elamite king, it's going to be very, very difficult to nail down the date of when the Battle of Genesis 14 occurred. We do know there was an alliance. Because we do have letters from Hammurabi forging an alliance with the Elamites. We just don't know exactly when the battle occurred. So, again, this is it's going to come down to probably sometime between where Hammurabi, forges that alliance with the Elamites and after he forges that alliance and sometime before he attacks the Elamites. Because ultimately what Hammurabi does is he actually ends up attacking his allies. So we don't know why relations broke down between Hammurabi and the Elamites, but they did eventually, and he eventually did attack his own allies. So we don't know exactly why or when that happened. So this is still a open question of research. So that's where we sort of stand on when exactly the battle took place. We just don't know. But there's he reigned for 40 years, so it was a long time, and that's a long time for that battle to have taken place. So we're going to have to wait and see what the evidence comes up in the future. So and sometimes archaeology is just like that. Sometimes we have questions of, well, we know something happened, but we just don't know when or the details. We know that, for example, like Thutmose IV had several, campaigns into the Levant. We just don't know when any of those took place because none of the regnal years are recorded. We know that, say, the records of Thutmose IV indicated he went into the Levant several times. We just don't know when. So we kind of have to sometimes live with that sort of thing, ambiguity. And that's just the ambiguity of doing ancient history. Super chat because I don't see a super chat here. Is this here? Okay. Chris, that's all. Asked the question. What do you think happened to Egypt after the Exodus? I think they signed the treaty with the Hittites. The fact is that the son of Ramses II had successfully negotiated a peace treaty with the Hittites. And having lost most of their army, there was actually no reason at that point not to sign the treaty with the Hittites. So I think Ramses II signed the treaty with the Hittites and then had to start slowly rebuilding his chariots. Now, he didn't lose all his army in this. We have to understand that that only the chariots were lost at the splitting of the Reed Sea. So Ramses II still had all his land troops, his infantry. So this allowed Egypt to continue to protect its own borders. So I think that was a very, very important aspect of this, is that Egypt was not actually left defenseless as a result of the Exodus. It was just its ability to conquer and to campaign was at that point very, very limited. And I think what happens afterwards is that Egypt starts losing its grasp on the Levant. It's about this time that we start seeing the incursion of, say, the Philistines from the north along the coastal plain of Canaan. And at the same time as the Philistines are invading in the west, the Israelites are going to be moving in to the Judean foothills from the east. And essentially what happens is the Canaanite city-states become sort of squeezed between the Philistines in the west and the Israelites in the east. And eventually the Canaanites are more or less supplanted or driven out by both parties. So I think at that point we start seeing Egypt lose control over the Levant. Even though it has just signed a peace treaty with the Hittites, I don't think it's able to really hang on to its holdings much at that point. We already see, for example, in the Merneptah stela, which is Merneptah was the successor to Ramses II, that the beginning of his conquest that Merneptah records in the Merneptah stela, he's already going after, say, Philistine cities. So already in the time of Ramses has already lost some of his cities to Philistines. So I think what's happening is that we see in like the Merneptah stela, it mentions two Philistine cities. It also mentions Hurrians and the Israelites are already in Palestine during the reign of Merneptah. So this sort of shows that already during the reign of Ramses II, as a result of the Exodus, they have sort of lost their hegemonic control. They still have the garrison towns in Canaan at the time of Ramses II and into the reign of Merneptah. But garrison towns aren't actually able to maintain a strong, powerful presence. They're really just minor administrative centers. The very most a garrison town had was like 1,000 Egyptians. And only half of those would have been, say, military personnel. Most of them would have been administrative. They're not meant to hold large empires. They're more meant to, say, keep small vassal city-states in check. So that's a very, very different proposition than, say, an imperial power like Assyria or Babylon used to do, where they would essentially invade, take apart the whole administrative apparatus, put in their own governors, put in their own soldiers. It's expensive to maintain an empire. Egypt was never willing to fork out the expense to hold its territories. It really just wanted to collect the tribute and, do what they wanted. So I think that there is a very much a dynamic here that Egypt sort of loses it at this point. It's sort of the beginning of the end, and really during the reign of Ramses IV, Ramses VI, they completely lose the Levant. Even during the reign of Ramses IV, Egypt is cut off from the Levant. It loses all contact with its garrison towns and is unable to really sort of even collect tribute at that point. So we do see the beginning of the end as a result of the Exodus. Okay, JD Freeds just contributed a super chat of $5. Thank you very much. Is the wings of the dawn reference in Psalm 139:9 a reference to the type of wing sun disk imagery we find on Hezekiah stela? The Wadjet disk is what you're talking about here, and it's very possible, yes. It is very, very true that the Bible does use analogous symbols from the ancient Near East. And what I mean by analogous symbols is they take the symbols of, say, divine powers that other cultures used and sort of Hebrewize them and bring them into their own, say, mythos and their own sort of writings. Like, for example, the cherubim are very much analogous to the winged goddesses we find in ancient Egypt. The seraphim are analogous to the Uraeus, the cobra goddesses we find in Egypt. So these are symbols that are essentially appropriated and made analogous for the purposes of Israelite religion to convey notions of the divine. So absolutely, the wings of the dawn could easily be the Wadjet disc of Hezekiah's seal, which we find all over temples in ancient Egypt. So we do find on Hezekiah's seal also, besides the winged solar disc, we also find Ankhs on there as well, which is the Egyptian hieroglyph for life. It means to live. So if the one of the great good kings of Israel had these sort of Egyptian symbols on his seal, well, we can kind of expect that, you know, they did not think it a big deal to use these symbols from other myths, other ancient religions, and put their own particular twist on them. This is not copying, though, but this is taking a resource, something that they were familiar with, and putting their own meaning on it. So we don't know exactly what meaning they would have ascribed to the Wadjet disc or to an Ankh, but we can sort of surmise that they did use these symbols. So in the case of the wings of the god of dawn, there is going to be some Yahwistic reference here that sort of transforms those symbols. So yes, absolutely, no doubt that it could have been one of these things, because it is so common. It is so common in Israelite religion. Okay, now we've already gone an hour and 8 minutes. I'm not sure if we should go on much longer here, but I will take a couple more questions and then we're going to call it a night. Now, one of the things I do want to make out is one of the reasons I'm doing this is to sort of reduce the number of questions I have to take in the video chats, because I am trying to get a lot of writing done. I've found that this month in particular, I mean, this morning I actually read a paper for a conference. And just this week alone, I've had to do one conference paper and one article for Biblical Archaeology Review for their blog. And I've got a book chapter due by the end of the week. So it's been a very, very busy week for me writing-wise. So I am finding that I'm now having to sort of reduce some of the questions I take in the normal YouTube comment sections. So I'm hoping if this live chat turns out to be popular, do this in place of some of the questions and answers I've had to take in the comment sections of the YouTube videos. I'll still answer questions that I feel are important, that I think that I haven't answered elsewhere, but I am doing this to hopefully start to limit where to better manage my time. Essentially, to better manage my time. So I'll take, again, a couple more questions, but we'll wrap it up in a few minutes. So I'm going to see what else we have here. Take this one here. Second here. Okay. If Yahu of Shasu is indeed Yahweh, would that cause problems? Didn't the descendants of Abraham live in that area? Yes. Now, the thing about the Shasu of Yahweh is it's actually Yahu, and we have to be careful here because we're not exactly sure what Yahu is. It's not written. The text where we find this is in Soleb Temple, that was written by Amenhotep III. We don't have a theophoric or a god determinative with that, so we don't know if this refers to a deity or place name. So we have to be a little careful here whether or not the Shasu of Yahu, we're talking about a Yahu being a place name or Yahu being a deity name. So we can't exactly be sure. So we have to be careful here. Having said that, would it be a problem theologically for the text? And the answer is no. really know. Because we are told that Moses is bringing Yahweh from his encounter when he lives in Midian. The Israelites did not worship Yahweh in Avaris. We do find evidence of the Canaanites at Avaris worshiping a variety of gods. And actually, there's a very important connection here to those gods. We find that evidence of Astarte, Resheph, and Baal at Avaris. In fact, there's a whole temple, Canaanite temple, built for Baal at Avaris. Now, when we talk about the Korah rebellion, what's going on here with Korah is these were Israelites, or Canaanites, became Israelites, that were priests who served as priests at the temple of Baal at Avaris, who now find themselves sort of excluded from the priesthood of Yahweh. So the whole Korah rebellion is focusing around these former priests that are now left out in the cold. And they're left out in the cold because they were doing priestly worship of Baal. And now they think somehow they were entitled to also become priests of Yahweh. But one of the things about Yahweh worship is if you want to worship Yahweh, you've got to do it Yahweh's way. So God is very particular about how we worship him. So in this particular case, where we have, say, these Israelites coming out of Egypt being essentially polytheists, and Moses bringing Yahweh worship from his encounters at Midian, it doesn't present any problem then that if we also find a text that talks about a Shasu of Yahu, and that could be Yahweh. That's a possibility, and it doesn't really cause a problem for the text. Now, we also have to be very circumspect even about the boundaries of Midian at the time. It is true that Midian was inhabited by descendants of Abraham. It's also, though, true that Midian was a lot more fluid back then than it proved to be, say, later on. Midian in the late Bronze Age covered both Saudi Arabia, Edom, and into the Sinai Peninsula. So there's actually a lot of geography there involved. So it could have definitely have come from descendants of Abraham. But we also don't know if Abraham actually knew of God by the name Yahweh, or if it was picked up by, say, the Midianites in another manner. Again, the text is not clear here. We're just, again, sort of guessing on this, but there's no problem with the text as far as that goes. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, and I will take one more question, and then we'll probably call it a night. Let's see here. JD Free says, thank you for your time. My pleasure. I really enjoy doing Q&A. Let's see here. I'm going to do this one because it's actually related to the last question. That one. Last question for the night. Come up in just a second here. Okay, Sean Baza. Is there any evidence of Israelites practicing monotheism or something similar in the Levant? The quick answer is no. Here's the problem with monotheism. Monotheism does actually begin at Mount Sinai. It's actually a consequence of practicing the Ten Commandments, the law. You know, when we look at, say, when the Israelites leave Egypt, they're bringing with them a lot of Bronze Age ideas of the ideas of localism, the idea that a god can be in only one place at one time. They're bringing with them henotheism, because uh, a lot of the Hyksos were actually henotheists. They they worshipped one god, but had other gods in their pantheon. So they typically worshipped Baal as the king of the gods, but they accepted that other gods existed. You had influences of pantheism from Akhenaten, the Atenist cult. So the Israelites are leaving Egypt with this huge diversity of, say, Bronze Age ideas of divinity, the localism, the pantheism, the henotheism. And they get to Mount Sinai, and then they're given the law. And that law basically says that, you shall have no other gods, quite literally, in my face, before my face. So God doesn't want to see the presence of other gods before him. It says, you shall not make idols of anything above the earth or on the land or in the sea or any created thing. Well, that excludes, animal deities of all sorts. Any created thing but God himself. So that sort of limits your options. Then you get into other things like the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath has a very, very interesting connection in that, it says, you shall work 6 days, and on the seventh you shall rest, just as God created for 6 days, and on the seventh day rested from it. That from it means from creation. There's the implication of theological transcendence. The idea that God is separate from creation. And that separation from creation is really, really important for the development of monotheism. By practicing the law, what ends up happening is that those who are influenced by pantheism, it only works because of theological immanence, the idea that God is part of creation. He's everywhere in creation. You separate God from creation, and what ends up happening is pantheism collapses into monotheism. This is why theological transcendence is so important to the development of monotheism. And what we have with the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai is the groundwork laid for theological transcendence. Now, it takes the Israelites hundreds of years to actually put that into practice. We read all through the Old Testament where the Israelites are essentially, fall back into polytheism. They're influenced when they come into the land of Israel by their neighbors. They take on other gods. And it's when they take on those other gods that sort of sets them back. And we really don't see strong evidence of monotheism until the Babylonian exile. Now, we do see strong evidence of Yahweh worship. They're worshiping Yahweh throughout their occupation of Canaan. But it only becomes monotheism when they sort of have to go into exile, and then they come back and they, try to get it right. So we do find monotheism eventually in the Levant, but it really comes as a result of the Babylonian exile. Until then, you've got patches of monotheism, you've got attempts at monotheism, but they never quite just get there, because they're always falling back into that sin of idolatry. So we do find it's a process, and it takes them hundreds of years to get it right. So I hope that answers your question. Now, that's going to be the last question for the night, and I very much appreciate all the super chats. Thank you again. It does help the channel. It does support the channel, and I really, really appreciate it. I am going to put a little link into the community chat on the Ancient Egypt in the Bible front page, and I'd like to get your feedback about these live chats, and I'd like to know if this is something that you would like to have repeated. I am open to doing this once a week if it's something that serves the community. Ultimately, this is for me a ministry that helps to serve the community, and hopefully I'm here to answer your questions and to bring a little bit of knowledge about ancient Egypt and the Bible to you. So again, please leave your feedback in the comments for this video and on the community page. And again, thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for your questions. That makes this all worthwhile doing. Again, I appreciate it. Have a good night, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and Bible.